All right, good evening, everyone. We are continuing Kuf Vav Amud Beis, 106b, second line from the bottom. Amar Rav, Rav says, talking about Netilas Yadayim, Amar Rav, Nota Adam Eshtei Yadav Shachris, a person could wash his hands in the morning, Umasne Alehen, and make a condition on that washing that Kol Hayom Kulo, that it should last for him all day long, right? Technically speaking, once you've washed, that's washing, and the only thing is that you have to make sure that you don't touch anything, or you take care of wash your hands. If you're not paying attention to them, then you got to wash again. But this could last for every time you need to eat bread or things like that. Once you've washed in the morning, that will be it. Amar lehu Rabbi Avina livnei pakta da'aravos. And Rabbi Avina told the people who lived in Pakta Da'aravos that Kegon Atun, you guys who are Delo Shchich L'chumaya, you live in a place where there's not a lot of water. So Mashu Yadaychu Mitzafra Ve'asnu Alayhu L'Kul Yoma. That's a good practice for you guys, right? Go ahead and do that, because it's going to be difficult for you to find water to wash for bread later on. So wash in the morning, and then have that in mind, that it can last all day.
But if you may be talking after you walk, there can be a
talking. So it seems that talking, we have the custom not to talk so that you will not distract yourself from your hands. Theoretically, I guess if they talked but remained undistracted, then it could stay. It could last. But of course, obviously, if you went to the washroom or if you touch something, like you touch your shoes or something, you'd have to wash again. Eged Amri, there are those who said b'shas hadachak in. You could rely on this only in a circumstance where there's no water. Shas t'chak, it's a stressful circumstance, not the normal circumstance. So then, but shelo b'shas t'chak, but not in a but if it's not that kind of a stressful circumstance, don't do this. And pligi de Rav, this argues with Rav, right? That Ravina is arguing with Rav. Avina said it was okay to do this, and Rav says no. The Ikadamri, and there are those who said afilu shelo b'shas t'chak nami, that you can even rely on this when it's not a shas d'chak, and hainu de Rav, and therefore Rav Avina was saying the same thing as Rav, that you could do this. Amar Rav Papa says, "Hi arisa de Deloy." They had like a pipe system, trenches that would go. They would be along the side of the field, and what they would do is they would take a bucket and fill it up from the water, and then pour it into the trench. Okay, so it needed a person to fill up the trench, but otherwise the water would then flow by itself. So you can't you can't pour the water off from that trench onto your hands, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're going to do Netilas Yadayim, you need what's called koach de gavra. You need the power of a person. A person has to be pouring it, and this water, once you poured it into the drain, then it's already been poured, and that's that. And this is also mikoch gavra. It doesn't come from the strength of a person. And also Rashi says you can't use it as a mikvah because there's no 40 saw of water in it either. So therefore you're going to be stuck. You can't dip your hands in it. You can't pour it over your hands. Mikarv legabe davla. However, let's say he puts his hands close to the pitcher where the water is, where he pours it in, then in that circumstance, you're basically putting your hands under where he pours it into the pipe from his bucket. So then then you can wash your hands from that, because then it's like koach gavra. Then you are getting a little bit of. This is very parallel to the question about, can you wash your Netilas Yadayim without a cup in a sink, right? So if you turn on the sink, so it's not going to work, because at that point, the water that's coming out is not koach gavra. It's not coming from the person, right? But if you were in a circumstance where you were in a pinch, right? I'm hearing somebody that suggested that if you turn on the water, the very first water that comes out from the spout is koach gavra, because that water comes out because you just turn the faucet. After that, the water doesn't count. So you have to turn it on, turn it off really fast. Turn it on, turn it off really fast. Theoretically. I don't know if people hold that, but I remember learning that when I was a kid. The faucets nowadays are very understanding. They do not get annoyed. So then you're allowed to wash yourself. Now, if your bucket has a hole in the bottom, dear Liza, so then kones mashke, So then that's going to be and the size of the hole is enough that water can get into it from the outside. It's not like a leaky that it leaks out of it, but actually water can get into it. So then melif laifi umat bi'bolas yadayim. So then what winds up happening because of that is you take your bucket, and as you're pouring, there's a stream of water coming out the back into the river, which connects the water from the river to the bucket, and then the water from your bucket is being poured into the pipes. Now you have a mikvah, because you have all the water that's in the pipes connecting to the water that's in the bucket, connecting back into the river, and now you can dunk your hand in it for tevilas yadayim, and that's what you can do. V'amar Rava says, Kli shenikov bekones mashke, if you have a utensil that gets a hole in it, the amount of size that it can allow water to go in, ain't not limi minal yadayim, you cannot use that container, you cannot use that cup to wash netilas yadayim. Right? So if you have a cup with a hole in it, don't use that for netilas yadayim. This is also practical if you have a cup with a spout, right? This is a very good cup for netilas yadayim. It's all even. But let's say I had a spout that was lower right here. I would not be able to wash netilas yadayim out of the part over here because then this is higher up above the spout, right? I'd have to use the lowest part of the cup because above that there's a hole, right? So if the cup has a hole, you cannot use it. The Amar Rava says, furthermore, Kli she'ein bo revius. Your utensil, if you have a utensil that doesn't hold a quarter of a lug, that's like 3 or 4 ounces, I don't know how many grams that is, that's like, 75, 80 grams, something like that, right? So it's holds a small amount. So if that...
Smaller than a shot glass?
I think shot glasses are like 2.2 ounces, if I'm not mistaken, right? So it could be 2 shot glasses worth. I'm not 100% sure. I'm not a shot glass expert. I believe it might be somewhere between 2 and 4 ounces. It's close to it. So you can't use that if it's too small. Then, if it doesn't have a revius, it can't be used for netilas yadayim. Any is that true? V'amar Rava says kli she'ein machzik revius ein not liminal yadayim ha machzik avagav deleis bei. So it says that if you have a utensil that doesn't hold a revius, you can't wash your hands. Now, what does that mean? That means if I have a utensil that is large enough to hold a revius, even if I don't have that much water in it, it's still kosher for netilas yadayim. Meaning, the question is, do I need a revius of water for netilas yadayim, or do I need a cup that can hold a revius even if it doesn't have a revius in it? So the answer is lo kasha. That's not a contradiction. Ha lechad, ha letrei. It depends on if you're washing for one person or if you're washing for 2 people. What does that mean? It's none. As we learned in our Mishnah, may revius, if I have water in the amount in a container in the amount of a revius, notlin liyadayim le'echad va'afilu shnayim. So I can wash netilas yadayim from that cup, not only for one person, but for 2 people, which is very interesting because if you have only one revius, how are you washing hands for 2 people? The answer is, since there was a revius in the cup when you started, so therefore, the second hand washing, despite the fact that you don't have a revius left, is considered a continuation of the first netilas yadayim, and it's as though you used a revius to wash both of their hands, and therefore it's acceptable. However, if it was only one person, and I had less than a revius to start off with, that would not be okay. Then I couldn't do that. Amarli Rav Sheshes Lamemar. Rav Sheshes says to Amemar, Kapdisu Amona. So, he asked him, Rav Sheshes asked a question, they asked Rav Sheshes Amemar, are you worried about the type of utensil that you have? Meaning, do you worry about whether it has holes in it? Amarli, and he says, yes, absolutely, that's the halacha. Achazusa, do you worry about what kind of water, right? In other words, if the water is gross, if it's not, like we had learned yesterday, if the water is unclean, right? Does that bother you? So Amarli, and he says, yeah, absolutely, right? Ashiura, do you worry about the amount of water? Do you need a revius? Amarli, and he said, yeah, I worry about that too. Okay, so all 3 of those are the halacha. Ikadamri, there are those who say, Hachar Amarli. This is what Amemar answered him. Amana v'chazusa kaptinun. I worry about the size of the utensil. I also worry about the clarity of the liquid. Ashiura lo kaptinun, but I don't care whether we actually have a revius of water or not. Ditznan, why? Because I learned in a Mishnah, may revius, notlin liyadayim le'echad v'afilu l'shnayim. If I have a revius of water, I can wash not only for one person, but even for 2 people. Velohi, and that's not a proof. That doesn't prove that you don't need a revius to wash. Shani also, because that's different, mishum dekasu mishiari tahara, that since the first washing started with a revius of water, you can continue on and wash the second guy, even though you have less than a revius. But generally speaking, you need a revius of water in order to start doing netilas yadayim. You can't walk up to the sink, fill up your cup like with a little drop of water and use that. Not enough. Askin Rav Yaakov min Nahar Bakod, Natla Bas Reviasa. So Rabbi Yaakov from Nahar Bakod, he made a utensil that was a revius in size. And what happened was, people would then go visit him and check to see how much that is, right? He basically had the master measurement, right? So he said, this is how big a revius is, and then if people want to make their own washing cups, they would test whether their washing cup held enough water by going to check his. Askin Ravashi behutzal kuza bas reviasa. And Ravashi, he made an earthenware utensil that was also the same idea, to be able to make sure that he had determined the size of the utensil. Vama Rava, and Rava says, megufas chavis shetikna. If you've got the lid of a barrel and you fix it up, how do you fix it up? We'll discuss that in a second. If you fix this barrel up, even though it wasn't intentionally designed to be a utensil, because it's a barrel cover, not a barrel that holds things, you can use it to wash netilas yadayim. Okay. Now Rashi says, what did you do? So a barrel cover is a lid, right? Just flat on the side. Let's say it's flat, right? And what you did is you carved into the inside of the lid to be able to make so that it has a little receptacle area so that it can hold enough water. Tosfos says, well, if you did that, then of course it's a utensil. You just turned it into a cup, right? So Tosfos says, no. Covers of barrels were slightly rounded, like a bowl shape on the bottom and flat on the top, right? And what would happen is, if you put water on the top and you put it down, the rounded bottom would shake, and therefore the water would spill off. So it's not a utensil. So if you flattened the bottom so that it would then stay still, and it would hold a revius of water on the top, that's the way you doctored the utensil. But in any event, you did something to the utensil in order to make this barrel cover be able to hold liquid. That's going to be enough to make it acceptable for netilas yadayim. Tanya nami hach, we have a brisa that also says so. Begufas chavis shetiknaf, you've got a barrel lid that you fixed. Not lemimenu liyadayim, you can use it to wash netilas yadayim. Chemes ucheshifa, if you've got water skins. Right? Back then when you would go in the desert, they wouldn't have, nowadays you see people have these canteens and they're metal and like solid, right? The way they would have is they would have animal hides that were basically, you could roll up, right? So when they're filled with water, so then they're large, they're inflated with liquid, but almost like water balloons, right? They would fill up with water. So those, by themselves, you can't use them for netilas yadayim. Why? Because they're not a utensil. Put them down and they just flop onto the ground. They don't, not helpful. But shetiknon, if you fix them up, right, meaning you stiffen it a little bit, do something to it to be able to help it keep its shape, notlin mehem liyadayim, then you could use it for netilas yadayim. Sak vekupa. So then if you've got a wicker basket or a box, so then afal pi shemekablim, even if they can take water on, in Loiterman, you'd never use those. Because nobody ever uses those things to hold liquids, right? A wicker basket. Even if this guy happened to make it waterproof, he rubbed some, something on the inside of it, or clay on the inside. Since that type of utensil is not good, we don't accept it. So you can't use that for netilas yadayim. So we asked the final question. Let's say you don't have any water. Can you wrap your hands in a napkin and eat without washing? Right? Can you do?
Or some people what some people do is they don't care wash. You can just don't touch your bread. Just pull it out from the bag.
In your bag, or gloves, right? If I'm wearing gloves, can I do that if I don't have water? So michashinon dilmanaga. What does it come down to? It's not a problem because if you don't touch it, right? If you don't touch the sandwich, it's not a problem. But maybe you will touch it. Right? Imagine it's in the bag, so as you're pushing it out, you might touch it. So therefore, that would be a problem. So, olo, or, no, you don't worry about that. The fact of the matter is, you're being careful. So tashma, so what's the halacha there? So tashma, ukeshenosnu lo l'Rabbi Tzadok ochel, when they would give Rabbi Tzadok some bread, pachos mikabetza, and they would give him less than an egg's volume of bread, not lo b'mapa, he used to take it in a napkin. Ochlo chutz l'sukkah, and he would eat that on sukkahs outside of the sukkah, ve'ein mevarach acharav, and he wouldn't bench afterwards, right? He had too little bread, he wouldn't bench. So my lav, so doesn't this tell us that ha kibetza by netilas yadayim, that the only reason why he wasn't washing is because he didn't have the prerequisite volume potentially to wash on. So since he didn't have an egg's volume, he didn't wash, he was and he was being stringent, and he was therefore using a napkin. But if he had a larger piece of bread, he would have washed, even though he had a napkin. So the answer is no. Dilma ha kibetza by sukkah ubay bracha. Washing isn't dependent on the side. This we do hold the halacha, right? If you're going to eat a piece of bread, so you wash on any size of bread. You just don't bench unless you eat a kibetza of it. Right? Or you don't eat it in a sukkah unless you have a kibetza.
Is there a different bracha you make instead of benching?
Not if you haven't had enough, right? If you haven't had enough for a bracha achrona, you haven't had enough, right? So therefore, right? So if you've had this, but you would still be able to. Doesn't prove anything about him needing to wash his hands and not use a napkin. So let's try again. Toshma, let's try and answer this another way. Shmuel ashkeche l'Rav de ka'achol b'mapa. Shmuel found Rav, and he was eating using a napkin. Amar lei, and he said, Avdin kedain. He was surprised. He says, you think you're allowed to do this? Or in Kuv Zayin on base, you're allowed to do this? You're eating with a napkin like this. Amar lei. So he says, Dati kitzar olai. He says, no, I've washed. It's just I'm a germaphobe. And so therefore, not only did I wash, I'm also using a napkin and not touching the bread. So therefore, that doesn't prove anything, right? It just means that he was extra careful. Kisalik Rabbi Zera, when Rabbi Zera went from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, Ashkechinhu Rabbi Ami v'Ravasi, he met Rabbi Ami and Ravasi, Tekachi Bavloi Chamasos. They were eating with, they were wrapping their hands with hides. Right? They're basically wrapping their hands up, and they were eating bread without netilas yadayim. So it sounded like Rabbi Zera thought that they were relying on this story that we just had above. The Amar, so he says, Amar, Trey Gavri Ravravi Kavasaichu Litu Bidiravu Shmuel. He says, two great people like you are making a mistake in what happened with Rav and Shmuel. Because both Rav and Shmuel stories, with the story that we have with Shmuel and the story that we had with Rav, they were not indicating that they were washed, that they were eating with their hands wrapped, right? It wasn't, we weren't able to prove. Because dati kitzara kamar, he explained that the only reason why he was eating with a napkin is because he was a germaphobe. And he didn't want to wash his hands and rely on that. So he washed and he used a napkin to be able to eat it. So, ish demit to say, hadama Rav Tachlifa baravimi amar Shmuel. But the Gemara ends up that Rabbi Zera had forgotten that which Rav Tachlifa baravimi said in the name of Shmuel, hetiru mapa le'ochle truma, that for Kohanim who eat truma, right, they're allowed to wrap their hands in napkins and to eat from there without netilas yadayim, because Kohanim have the characteristic of being zrizim. Kohanim, that's us. We're very, very cautious, very careful, Kohanim. So therefore, since Kohanim are extra careful, they were given permission to eat their truma without washing and using a napkin. But people who are eating chulin, who are eating regular produce in a state of purity, right? They're not so careful all the time, so they're not allowed to not wash and just eat using a napkin. So they weren't allowed to. V'Rabami, v'Rabasi, Kohanim havu, and Rabami and Rabasi were Kohanim. So therefore, that's why they were able to eat without washing. They were eating using a napkin because that was okay. So now, in practice, la halacha, right? The halacha is that if you are in a severe pinch, right? There's no water around any place, then you can rely on that. You can eat your sandwich out of a plastic bag. If you have a water bottle, use the water bottle. If it's a 15-minute walk, go take a walk and get some water, right? It's not like, oh, I'm at a recess and I don't want to go back inside, so therefore I can eat my sandwich with my in the plastic bag, but you should go inside. But if you're, in the desert, right, and you don't have any water with you, and you have a sandwich and you want to eat, so then you can rely on the shita and not touch the bread. So, a question comes up, right? then we measure the distance in terms of how much time it takes to travel back. And so the question that modern posts can deal with is, what if you're in a car, right? Do we say in those times 15 minutes was what, like a couple miles, right? And now a couple miles is like 2 minutes, 3 minutes in the car. So is that the same now? Or do we say that it's 15 minutes of a drive, right? So the bottom line is, we're trying to be a little bit more stringent on it. So if you're 15 minutes to the next exit and you can get off, and
you rest up really good.
right? Or you got a water bottle in the car, then that's what you should use.
What about on subway?
So, if you're on a subway, you could be in for a challenge, right? Because you might not be able to find water on a subway. That's true, right?
Unless the subway has a washroom in it.
Okay. Iboilu. So they asked the following question. Ochel machmas machil. What if somebody is being fed, right? I'm not touching the food. Somebody's putting the food in my mouth.
They could be
like feeding a baby, or like the Romans with the grapes, right? Whatever, however you want to envision it, right? This guy, I don't know, maybe he's got, he broke his arms, and somebody's got to feed him, right? So now somebody's feeding him, he's not touching the food. Does he have to wash before eating bread? Right? Question. So Taushma, come and listen. Rav Huna bar Sechora havakoi kame de Rav Hamnuna. Rav Huna bar Sechora, he was standing by Rav Hamnuna, and balam le umtza, and he was cutting up for Rav Huna pieces of meat with bread, and he was putting it in Rav Hamnuna's mouth, feeding Rav Hamnuna. I don't know if Rav Hamnuna was sick, or whether this was just a nice thing to do for his Rabbi. Ve'achil, and Rav Hamnuna was eating it. Amar le. So Rav Huna bar Sechora said to Rav Hamnuna, "Ilav de Rav Hamnuna, you should know, if you were not Rav Hamnuna, lo safina lach, I would not put this bread in your mouth. My time, what's the reason? Why for that? Lav mishum de zahir velo naga. Is it because he's Rav Hamnuna? So Rav Hamnuna is very careful, and he wouldn't touch the bread. So he's saying, if you were just a normal guy, you would just grab the sandwich from me and take it and put it in your mouth. But since you're Rav Hamnuna, you're not going to do that because you know the halacha. That's why I'm doing this." The answer is low. That's not why. The fact is that he was Rav Hamnuna. Therefore, he did wash his hands first. Even though someone was feeding him, he still was makbid to wash his hands, wash the Netilas Yadayim anyway. So that's what he says. If it was anybody else, I would presume I wouldn't feed them this way because maybe they didn't wash their hands. Because you're Rav Hamnuna and I know you washed, that's why I am.
Because you're Rav Hamnuna, you get full service.
That's correct. That's right. Otherwise, it would be self-service. Tashma, come and listen. Amar Rab Zera. Rabbi Zera asked that. Rabbi Zera says, "Amar Rav, name of Rav. Lo yitim adam prusa letoch piv shel shamash." A person, they used to have servants at the meal, right? So the servant was given whatever they gave him at the table. That was his that's I guess the original tips, right? The tip of the steak, tip of the bread, whatever it was, right? So you're not all this. They would pick up a piece of bread and just put it in his mouth. Here, that's your tip, right? Like they do for dolphins at the show or something, right? So you're not allowed to put a piece of bread into the shamash's mouth, unless you know that he washed. He has to wash first. But shamash mevarech al kol kos v'kos. The other rule about a shamash is that they would give him wine to drink from the meal. He has to make a borei piragafon in every cup that he drinks. Why? Because normally the rule is that I take my drink, I drink my coffee, and I'm not going to make another bracha when I take another sip. Why? Because I have in mind when I started drinking my coffee that I'm going to drink the whole cup.
How about the wine?
When I have wine, so I have in mind I'm going to drink more wine with my meal, so I don't need another drink. But the shamash, he can't drink unless they give him permission. So therefore, he takes one drink. As far as he's concerned, that could be the last one. So therefore, when they give him another one, he can't say I had in mind that I was going to have more. So he has to make another bracha. Okay, because it takes his mind off of it. Ve'ena mavarich al kol prusa uprusa, but right, you don't have to make a bracha on every single piece of bread, right? Because for bread, right, since he knows that wine is a luxury, bread is a staple, right? He knows they're going to give him more bread, so therefore he can rely on the bracha that he made on the bread for the future bread. For Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan says, Mevarich al kol prusa says, no, he doesn't know what he's going to get. So therefore he's got to make a bracha on every piece of bread that comes along. Okay, so now, Amar Rav Papa, Bishlama de Rabbi Yochanan. I understand Rabbi Yochanan, de Rav Rabbi Yochanan. I understand what Rav and Rabbi Yochanan says. Lokasha, there isn't a question of contradiction. Ha deika adam chashuv, ha deleka adam chashuv. Right, if you've got a important person with them at the meal, right? So therefore, he knows that if he doesn't eat, the important person is going to make sure that he's taken care of, right? And Rabbi Yochanan is saying, no, he's got to big, everyone is when there's nobody below Adam Chashav. So they're not really arguing. One is suggesting that if you've got a good person at the meal, they're going to make sure to take care of the waiter. And if you're not a good person, if they don't have any good people, so then you're not going to take care of them. So Mikol Makom, however, right, this question, Hakamar Elim Ken Yodesh Notel Yadav. The question that we really want to be able to point out is that you're not allowed to put bread in his mouth unless you know that he washed his hands. So shouldn't that answer our question? That you can't feed another person unless you know he washed his hands? So the answer is no, Shani Shamash Ditrid. A Shamash is different because he is so busy with the meal, he doesn't pay attention, and he might actually touch the food that goes in his mouth, right? The person's putting it in his mouth, and he'll just take it and push it in a little bit because he's not paying attention. So therefore, a shamish is different, and therefore, maybe a shamish does have to wash his hands, whereas others don't. Tana Rabbanan. So let's try again. Lo yitin odam prusa l'shamish. A person shouldn't give a piece of bread from the meal to the servant. Bein shakos biyado. It doesn't matter whether the cup is in the hand of the servant or whether he's already handed it off to the owner of the house. Yera davar kalkala bisuda, because it'll spill during the meal, and maybe the owner of the house will get upset that V'ashamash lo notel yodav asur litain prusa letoch piv. So sorry, as far as that was yerav davar tekol besuda, right? So a person who's a guest. That's what's going on here. There's a guest. A guest is not allowed to give bread or wine can't give bread to the servant during the meal because the host might be upset. Right?
Because it's not really your bread to be.
It's not yours. That's exactly right. So he might be upset, so he shouldn't do that. But the shamash shalo yunatel yadav, if the shamash hasn't washed his hands, asur litain prusa letoch piv, he can't put a piece of bread into his mouth. So therefore, you see, right, that he's got to wash. Even if somebody's feeding you, got to wash first. Iboilu. So he asks, fine question. Machil tzarich netilas yadayim owein tzarich. The guy who's feeding him, does he have to wash his hands? He's not eating. You don't have to wash your hands if you're eating bread. So if I'm the guy who's taking the bread and sticking it in the other guy's mouth, does he have to wash? So, Toshma, come listen. The Tani de Be Menashe, the word in Yeshiva Ben Menashe, Rabbi Shimon Ben Gamliel says, Isha medicha es yada achas b'mayim v'nosenes pas levana katan. Allowed to wash one of her hands in water so that she can take the piece of bread and give it to her kid, right, that is not obligated to fast. So I use on Yom Kippur, because on Yom Kippur we're not allowed to wash our hands. So
you have to.
That only if you're not going, you have to. So if she's going to have to give the food to her kid, we say, why wash both hands? Wash one hand, and then she can use that to feed her child, right? But you see that a person who's feeding the other person does have to wash their hands. Amru alav al Shammai Azakin, they said about Shammai the elder, Shelo ratzu lahachil biyado achas, he was stringent, and he didn't want to wash only one hand on Yom Kippur in order to give his child food, so therefore, he didn't give his kid food. And v'gazru alav sheyachil b'shtei yadav. So they made a takana on him, and they said, you'd better feed your kid with two hands, right? In other words, you've got it wrong, right? You're trying to be machmir on washing, and really you got to be machmir in taking care of your kid. So therefore, they made a statement by forcing him to feed his kid with two hands. Amar Abaye says, Hasam mishum shivta. He says, right, that wasn't the topic wasn't washing his hands for eating. It was washing his hands in the morning. And at that point, right, he hadn't washed his hands in the morning. And we were worried about what's called ruach ra, right? Germs that are on your hands when you wake up in the morning. So therefore, that's why we're allowing you to wash your hand before giving it to the kid. Meaning we're not worried that you have to wash before feeding it to a child. It's just that you can't have dirty hands with germs all over them when you're feeding your child. So therefore, that's why we're permitting it. So it has nothing to do with netilas yadayim. It's not a rule. So you're not going to rule from here that you have to do netilas yadayim before feeding somebody else. Just wash your hands before you start cooking, right? That's a different halacha, a different rule. Okay? Tashma, come and listen. Davud de Shmuel ashkechei l'Shmuel de kabachi. The Shmuel's father found Shmuel crying one time. Right? I guess he was young, right? We would presume, right? He was young at the time. Amar le, his father said to him, Amai kabachis, why are you crying? So he said to him, Demachyan Rabbi, because my Rebbe hit me. So Amai, so, why did your Rebbe hit you? So he says, Damar li kasafis labrai velo mashis yadach, right? Because, he said, you fed my son bread and you didn't wash before you gave him the bread. So that's a problem.
That's discipline, basically.
So the Rabbi disciplined him. So you got to know the halacha. So v'amai lo mashis. So why didn't you wash hands? So Amar so Shmuel said, "Hu achil v'ano mashina." He says he's eating and I have to wash. That makes no sense. It's not the halacha. Amar lo mistaye de lo gemir mimcha nami machi. So Shmuel's father said to his son, "It's not enough that your Rebbe isn't an expert in Hilchos Netilas Yadayim, but he's hitting somebody who doesn't follow his mistake, right? Your Rebbe's wrong, right? The Rebbe shouldn't hit you, and that wasn't the right thing, right? You are correct. You know the halacha, and he's incorrect. The halacha is ochel machmas machil. Somebody who's eating because somebody's feeding him. Tzarich l'netilas yadayim. He has to wash. Machil, somebody who's feeding the other person, he does not have to wash. Right? Only the person who's eating has to wash. Okay, let's get back to meat and milk. Next Mishnah. Tzorer Adam Basar Ugvina Bibmat Pachas Achas. Guy's going to work. And he has a bag of dairy chips and a meat sandwich. And he puts them both in the same lunchbox, right? Not a problem, right? No. He is allowed to pack meat and cheese in the same wrap. As long as you make sure that they don't touch each other, right? Put them in separate bags, separate containers inside the bag.
If you have mac and cheese, and the cheese from the mac is your front of the meat there.
Sorry?
If you have mac and cheese,
yeah.
Some of the cheese you drip on top of the.
Okay, so you got to put it in a container that doesn't drip, right? If you have a bad container, that's no good. Yeah.
If you said to keep it separate, can you wrap with like the meat and the cheese just like in different layers?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like. Yes, exactly. I don't think they didn't have Tupperware back then. Right, we have good, nice, solid plastic bags in Tupperware. They were wrapping it in towels and things, right? Whatever they had, rags or whatever. That's how they were wrapping their piece of meat and their cheese, right? That's how they would wrap it, and that's okay. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, if you've got two guests that come from different places, Ochlin al shulchan echad ze basar ze gvina, right? This happens all the time this is where we wind up. You come to school, right? And, somebody wants to eat, somebody pulls out of their lunchbox meat, somebody pulls out of the lunchbox dairy. So can they eat meat and dairy on the same lunchroom table, right? So if you show up, so this says, two strangers, they don't know each other, so one can eat meat at the table and one can eat cheese. Fein choshen, we don't worry about it. Not worried about it if they can both eat at the same table, meat and cheese. Now, keep in mind, the table may be treif, right? Let's presume that you took a plastic tablecloth, right? You put it over the table, right? So now the table is nothing. Table parv. One guy takes out his meat sandwich, one takes out his dairy sandwich. They don't know each other. No problem. Okay, let's say the Gemara. Zeba zeb my havi. So v'chi nogeh zeba zeb my havi. Tzonin b'tzoninu. I don't understand the problem. You got your piece of cheese and you got your cold cuts. Let them touch each other. What's the problem? They're cold. The flavor doesn't absorb. So what's the problem? So Amar Abaye. So Abaye says, "Nehi deklipa loboy hadachami loboy." Because okay, fine, you're right. The flavor doesn't absorb, but you'll have to wash it off, right? You'll have a piece of cheese on your meat that you don't want. So therefore, that's why we're giving the suggestion. Keep them separate, wrap them separately. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, Shnei achsanoin ochin al shulchan, right? Two guests can eat at the same table. Amar Rav Chanan bar Ami Amar Shmuel. Rav Chanan bar Ami said, Rav Shmuel, Lo shanu ella she'ein makirin zezeh. It has to be that they don't know each other. This is what's important, right? If you're at school and your classmates, it doesn't work that way. Avam makirin zezeh. If you know the person, then it's aser. Then it's prohibited. Why? Because you'll share. People trade snacks, right? So if I know the guy, right? Somebody reach over, go, I'll take one of your fries. That's okay, right? Because we're friends. That's no good. Tanya Nami Achi, we have a brisa. It has to be they don't know each other. We have a brisa also supports this. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, Shnei ach senoyim misarchu lepundak. The brisa explains it much more clearly. Right? You have two guests that are visiting a hotel. One guy came from the north, one guy came from the south. They never met each other. So one guy pulls out his piece of meat. So one guy pulls out his cheese. They can eat on the same table. Zebasar, this one eating meat, this one eating cheese, not a problem. Lo asru, the prohibition comes in, elabit achas. Right? That only happens if they're eating it from one container. So it sounds like we're eating it mamish together. So tfisa achas savkodaitach. Do they really mean literally together? Ella ke'ein tfisa achas. We mean that they're eating it in the style of it being wrapped together. Meaning, they're on one tablecloth. There's no separation, right? Then that's where there's a problem if you know each other. However, right, if one guy's got a red placemat and the other guy's got a blue placemat, that's okay. Right? Even family members, even if you're on the same table with your family, right? And you're having leftovers night, and one guy wants the leftover macaroni and cheese, and one guy wants the leftover hamburgers, that's okay, as long as you pull out separate tablecloths. You can put on the table something that is not usually there to remind you.
Like a garbage bag, for example.
Right, put a garbage bag, put some flowers on the table that are not normally there, put some, like a vase or something, put something on the table that reminds as a recognition that, hey, we can't share with each other, right? Then you can do it, right? Then you have to make some indication that you're eating separately. Otherwise, we would be concerned that two people sitting at the same table together who know each other are going to share. Amar le Rabbi Yemar bar Shalemya labai. So Rabbi Yemar bar Shalemya says to Abaye, Shnei achin, what if you have two brothers, and everybody who's got a brother knows the case, two brothers, and I don't want him touching my stuff, right? So that's, right? He's going to reach for my fry, and I'm going to whack his hand. He's not touching my stuff, right?
Keep your hand off my fry.
So is that like they're strangers or like they know each other, right?
They know each other.
So Amar le, so he said back to him, Yomru kol hasrikin asurin, vesriki baitus mutarin. He says, what do you think people are going to say then? They're going to take a look at these brothers, and they're going to say, well, we're talking about srikin. This is the story that comes out that in Maseches Psachim. And what happened was that in their day, in order to decorate the matzahs, they had some artists that were carving designs on the matzahs and making pictures on them. And that would help the value of the matzah sell in the marketplace. And the Chachamim said, we don't want you doing that because you only got 18 minutes to bake this matzah. And the artist is sitting there putting all the details on, and you can wind up with real chametz problems. So they said, no drawing designs, okay? Comes along one baker, and he says, yeah, but I've got a mold. Right? I've got just this mold, and what you got to do is you just got to take it and like Play-Doh, press it on there, and then put it in the oven, and I've got a design. So can I do mine? So the Chachamim said, no. Why? Because what? People are going to think that they're going to see your matzah, and they're going to think that it's okay to do designs, and then they're going to do it wrong. So therefore we said, no designs, so no designs. That's the same rule by the brothers. What are they supposed to know? These two brothers don't share? They're going to see two brothers eating together, and they're going to think they can eat at the same table together. So therefore, no, there's no way for people to know which two brothers get along, which brothers don't get along. So therefore, they're not allowed to eat together at the same table. Now, according to your reasoning, that you have to worry about that here. What about what Ravasi said in Rabbi Yochanan? Let's say you've got one person, a person's got only one shirt. Okay? Guy's got only one shirt. He's allowed to do laundry on Chol Moed. Right? Chol Moed, you can't do laundry, right? But I've only got one clean Shabbos shirt, right? As practically speaking, that's unusual, but sometimes people have only one suit, right? So the guy's got one suit and he spills soup all over it. So now what's he supposed to do? You can do laundry, right? You can do laundry if you've got one shirt. So Why is he allowed to do his laundry? People are going to see him coming out with a clean shirt, and they're going to say, that this guy with the mold shouldn't be allowed because everybody else will think it's okay. So they're going to see this guy with a clean shirt and think, oh, laundry's okay. So we shouldn't let him do it. So the answer is no. He says, no, his belt is going to prove it. Why? Because when a person has, they had matching belts, I guess, that went with their shirts. And so therefore, if the guy, people I guess might not notice the shirts, or I guess maybe the shirts were all the same, but they had different belts. Well, this guy's only got one shirt, one belt. So if he's wearing the same belt every day, people realize he's only got one shirt. And so therefore, if this guy keeps wearing the same belt every day, so then they realize that this guy's got one shirt, that's why he's allowed to do laundry. It's pretty clear why he's wearing a clean shirt, right? So that's why people are not going to make the mistake. Okay, next Mishnah. Back into taruvos, back into mixtures. Tipas cholav shenafla ala chaticha. If I've got a drop of milk that falls onto a piece of meat, and we'll go with Rashi's explanation, because otherwise it can get confusing. Rashi's explanation, Tosafos explanation. Rashi's explanation is the meat is half in the stew. He's got his chulin, and the meat is half in, half out. Drop of milk hits the meat, and because the part of the meat is outside, so that piece of meat, so im yesh babenosein tam, if there's enough milk that will give flavor ba'oso chaticha to that piece of meat that it hits, so then ulcer. Then that piece of meat becomes prohibited. We don't say that we have to take a look at the whole cholent and say that there's 60 times in the cholent to that drop of milk. We look only at that piece of meat because that piece of meat was half not in the cholent. So therefore that piece of meat can become prohibited. Then the near esakadera, so then it becomes prohibited. So now near esakadera, next case is, let's say the milk hits the piece of meat and you stir the pot. Right? You didn't realize, I guess, the fell in, drop falls in, and you're stirring the pot, and it falls in, now that everything's stirred up.
It makes the pot not kosher.
Well, it's only a little bit. So, im yesh ba benosein tam, if there's enough milk that it gives a flavor, but also kadir in that pot, so then it's also, then it's prohibited. So now you're looking at the whole pot because the whole pot got stirred. So it all depends. What's the item that needs to be nullified, that's doing the nullifying here? Is it the piece of meat? When you don't stir, it's the piece of meat. When you do stir, it's the entire pot. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi, Rabbi says, Tamo velo mamasho bi'alma d'oraisa. The concept that the flavor of something, right, of a prohibited item, is as though it is really physically still there, is always a Torah rule, right? And because when it comes to basar b'cholav, right, when basar b'cholav, meat and milk, is prohibited when you cook them together. We're cooking, why is that prohibited? Because by cooking them together, you transfer flavors. So if I transfer the flavor of milk into the meat or meat into the milk, so now I wind up with something that's prohibited. And even though, right, the item itself, right, I can't, right, there's only the flavor of the milk remaining, since that flavor still exists, it's as though you now have a piece of prohibited item in this prohibited milk meat basar b'cholav piece. Because if you would have thought that it's d'Rabbanan, it's only rabbinic, so mi basar b'cholav my time alo gamrinon. Why would we not have learned it from meat and milk to other prohibitions? The chidushu, we might have said, because by meat and milk is a very unique case. What's unique about meat and milk? Meat and milk, Rashi says, is very unique because every other time you have a prohibited item, something's prohibited, something's permitted, and I mix them together, and now I have to decide whether the prohibited item prohibits the permitted item. Meat and milk are two permitted items. Milk is kosher, meat is kosher. But I mix them together, they become prohibited. Well, that's very unique, right? So since they are, yes, one of Rashi's explanations, since that is a uniqueness, I might have thought that that's why we wouldn't be able to learn that even though the flavor of meat and milk makes the milk and meat prohibited, that isn't the case by other prohibitions. But if that was true, that I couldn't learn from meat and milk, I would have said that, well, it's such a chiddush, that means that meat and milk would be prohibited even if it doesn't give a flavor. I.e., if I don't have normally we have said that milk can be nullified in a 60-to-1 ratio, right? Well, maybe it doesn't get nullified. If you're telling me that meat and milk doesn't follow the rules of the rest of everything else, why are we presuming that 60-to-1 should solve the problem? So therefore, the fact that meat and milk gets nullified in a 60-to-1 ratio indicates we can learn from meat and milk. And therefore, if we're learning from meat and milk, we have this idea that the flavor is like the ikr, is like the main thing. It's like the real prohibited item. Rava doesn't like it. Amar le Rava. Rava says, derech bishul asra Torah. Right? The Torah prohibited, right, only cooking. Right? That's why it needs to be able to provide flavor. Right? And Amar Rav says, Kevan shenoson tam bechaticha, right? Since we said that if a piece of milk drops on the piece of meat, once it gives a flavor to that piece of meat that it falls on, chaticha atzma nases nevela. That piece of meat becomes not kosher. Right? That piece of meat now becomes basar b'cholav. It is not kosher. Ve'oseres ko chatichos kulon. And then, not only are we trying to nullify that drop of milk, now we have to nullify the piece of meat. Okay, so let's remember that, right? I've got a piece of meat, it's this big, right? And I drop a little bit of milk on it. Now, if that milk had dropped into the whole cholent pot, then there's plenty of cholent in this pot to nullify that little bit of milk. But now that the milk dropped on this piece of meat, the meat becomes a prohibited piece of meat. That's meat and milk. Now that I have this chunk of prohibited meat, now I need 60 times that whole chunk of meat in the cholent pot. That's what tam kicker means. That means the taste, the flavor of that milk made the whole thing prohibited. The oseres koach chatichos kulan prohibits all of the chatichos mipnei shehein mino. Why? Because everything else that's in that pot is also meat. And we have a rule that we have learned from Yehuda that min b'mino ain't a batal. Two items of the same type don't get nullified. So therefore the meat will never nullify. So you've got milk that somehow is never nullified because now the milk became part of the meat, and the meat can never be nullified, and the meat has the flavor of the milk. Amar le Mar Zutra breder of Mari le Ravina. So Mar Zutra, the son of Rav, Mari says to Ravina Mechti, Rav keman Amar l'shmate. Who's Rav holding like? Let's try to figure out who's Rav holding like here. Rabbi Yehuda. He's holding like Rabbi Yehuda. Amar min b'meino l'bata. We just said, why is the meat not nullified? Because meat with other meat doesn't get nullified. That is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that we had learned, that two types of the same item never are nullified. Lema pligi adirava. Okay, so now are we suggesting that this is an argument on what Rava says? Damar Rava, because Rava says, Kasavar Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Yehuda also holds, Kol shehu davar acher, Kol shehu min bemino v'davar acher, so like as mino kemi she'eno v'she'eno mino rabba alav umevat lo. If you've got a cholent, and in that cholent is meat, but also potatoes and beans and all kinds of other items in there as well. So ignore the other meat that's in there. You have to look at this cholent pot as though it is items that are not the same type as the meat. You don't say, hey, this is meat and the other meat doesn't get nullified. You have to look at the entirety of the cholent pot and say, since the cholent is a mixture of so many different things, all of those other things nullify this piece of non-kosher meat. The other pieces of meat don't count, don't matter. So therefore, it will nullify. So therefore, even if you hold like Rabbi Yehuda, why is the meat not being nullified in the rest of the pot? The rest of the pot has other things in it. So Amar Le, so Ravina answers, I denafal berot of raka hakanami. You're right. If it fell in a cholent that was hot, and there was gravy was all there, and everything was liquidy, so you're right. Then you've got potatoes, and you've got beans, and you've got everything, all of that. Hachab, I'm asking, what's going on here? Denafal berot of ova. You've got a thick, right? This is like that when the cholent gets all chunky, right?
Chulinated.
Chulinated, is that good? Yeah, that's a good word for it, right? It's chulinated. Once it gets chulinated, so then at that point, right, it's all one chunk, right? Then it's all min b'mino again, right? So then that's why it never gets nullified. Umay kasavar. Now, what is Rav holding, right, as far as this concept of chaticha nasas nevela, that the piece of meat becomes a prohibited item? I kasavar efshel l'sochta mutter. Question is, what are we trying to nullify? Are we trying to nullify the bit of milk that fell in, or are we trying to nullify the entire piece of meat? So that's going to depend on whether you hold of a concept of efshel l'sochta mutter. If you are able to squeeze it out, can you nullify, can you squeeze out the milk? Meaning, if I take this prohibited piece of meat that has 1 gram of milk in it, and it gets mixed in together with 60 grams of meat, with other meat, is it now nullified? Is the milk nullified? Or do I worry about the meat chunk? The meat chunk has 10 grams of meat, which has a drop of milk in it, and now I need 600 grams of meat in order to nullify the 6 grams, or the whatever, 60 to 1, 10 grams of meat, right? So chaticha, so if he's going to say that after l'sochto mutter, that I'm really only trying to nullify that piece of milk, that little bit of milk, so then chaticha my nases nevela, then why would that piece of meat become prohibited? In the rest of the cholent, compared to the rest of the meat, that meat's going to nullify that little drop of milk. Right, that little drop of milk that fell on that meat is going to become nullified. Rather, what he must be holding is that even if that milk were to be nullified, it wouldn't matter. That piece of meat is prohibited forever. Once that first piece of meat absorbs milk, that piece of meat is now forever prohibited. You can't nullify and make that original piece of meat permitted. You can at best fix the rest of your cholent, right? But you can't fix that piece of meat. De'itmar. As we said in the base medrash, Rav, Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan Damri, they all say, Efshar l'sochto aser, that if the milk is able to become nullified, it still remains prohibited. Shmuel, Rabbi Shimon, by Rabbi, V'reish Lakish Damri, all of them say, Efshar l'sochto mutter, that you can nullify the milk and it become permitted. The Sava Rav, now, is it true? Now let's put all these things together. Is it possible, Rav is holding like Rabbi Yehuda, he's holding that the milk can't become nullified, and that the piece of meat can never become nullified, and that piece of meat gets the flavor, becomes prohibited. He holds all of those things. So let's figure what's going on here. For Sava Rav, can Rav really hold Efshar l'sochto aser, that this little drop of milk can never become nullified? Didn't we say, Kazayas basar shenafel l'toch yora shel chalav? If I've got one olive piece of meat that falls into a giant pot of dairy, right? I'm making Alfredo sauce, right? And now I drop a piece of meat in there. Amar Rav says, basar aser chalav mutter. The meat becomes prohibited, but the dairy is still okay. So now, why? If you're going to tell me that even if you could squeeze out, it still remains prohibited, so chalav amay mutter. Why should the milk be permitted? Chalav nevelo. What's going to happen is the milk will get absorbed into the meat, right? And then it will then release from the milk meat becomes a prohibited item. That prohibited item will now impart flavor to the rest of the milk, and the milk and other milk will never become nullified. So therefore, why is the rest of the milk permitted? So the answer is liolam kasava Rav efshar l'sochto aser. Rav really holds that something that once the piece of meat gets absorbed, it becomes prohibited. That milk becomes prohibited. V'shani halsam, but this is different. Damar Kro, the pasuk says, very interesting. Lo sif ashel gedi bechalevi mo aser Torah gedi aser Torah velo chalav. It only goes one way. When you cook meat and milk, the meat is prohibited, the milk is not. Shocking, but we don't hold that way. Right? That's the first suggested opinion. That's what Rav is holding. Why is it if I drop a piece of milk into the pot, that milk is going to prohibit the meat, but if I drop a piece of meat into the pot, the milk is still permitted? Because milk doesn't get prohibited. Only meat becomes prohibited. Because the Torah says, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. It doesn't say don't cook milk in a kid. Right? So therefore now, the Sava Rav, does that make any sense? Does Rav really hold Gedi Asra Torah Velo Chalav, that the kid is prohibited but not the milk? V'ha Itmar, was it already said in the base medrash, Chatzi Zayis Basar v'Chatzi Zayis Chalav? If you have half of a kazayas of meat, half a kazayas of milk, this feels like a Reese's peanut butter cup commercial, right? I've got half a kazayas of milk, and you've got half a kazayas of meat. Shebishlan Zeim Zeh, and you cook them together. Amar Rav says, Lo ke'al achila, so you are going to get lashes for eating. You've got a kazayas of meat and milk. And vein lo kal bishlo, but you're not going to get lashes for cooking. We'll have to go over that tomorrow. If you're going to tell me that only the meat is prohibited, not the milk, so why are you getting lashes for eating it? Because chatzi shir, all you've got is a half a kazayas of meat that's prohibited. The milk is not prohibited. Must be, the milk is prohibited. So I've got half kazayas of prohibited milk, half kazayas of prohibited meat. Now I've got a full kazayas of basar b'cholov. So, Ella liol kasav Rav cholov nami yoser. Rav really is holding that milk is also prohibited. V'halcha b'mayaskinan, what's going on here? Kigon shenafel l'toch yora rotachas. What's going on? Second answer. What happened is this piece of meat fell into this Alfredo sauce. What happened is that it was boiling. And the rule is, demivla bola miflat lo polat, that when something is boiling, it absorbs flavor, it doesn't spit flavor out. So therefore, the meat will absorb the milk flavor, but the meat will not expel the prohibited milk back into the milk mixture. And that's why it doesn't. Sof, ki nayach hadar polit. Okay, but still, at the end of the day, so then it's going to cool off. And as soon as it starts to cool off, the milk is going to come back out and prohibit it. So the answer is, you took the piece of meat out before that happened, right? You stuck a spoon in there and you scooped it out before that happened, and therefore that's why it never happened. Okay, we will stop here. Gufa. We are nearing